Who invented the telescope? When I say telescope, the first thing that pops in your head is Galileo, right? Galileo, guy who used a telescope, got accused of heresy. It was all sorts of crazy stuff going on back in the early 1600s. Galileo didn't invent the telescope. He just used it and got famous because of it. The first recorded mention of a telescope that we know of today was actually in a letter dated September 25th of 1608, and it references someone who, quote, claims to have a certain device by means of which all things at a very great distance can be seen as if they were nearby, by looking through glasses which he claims to be a new invention, end quote. Now, before this letter, there may have existed telescopes. We don't have actual physical, discussion about it or any telescopes to speak of from that time. But we do know for sure that there were glass lenses. There were mirrors before 1608, so people could have put those together to create a telescope. Someone tried to patent the telescope in 1608. So even though they tried to patent it, the idea might not have been actually that new since the parts were around. But getting back to that, 1608. A Dutch spectacle maker named Hans Lippershey applied for a patent for a telescope after about a week after that letter was sent. It's not clear in the research for this episode if that letter that we talked about was referring to Hans or for someone else who was looking for a patent, but there's evidence that on October 2nd, really, really close in time to that letter, someone applied for a patent. Lippershey was denied that patent because a Dutch committee felt the invention was too easy to replicate. However, the government did then pay him to make a bunch of telescopes for them. And in fact, it was so easy to replicate because there's also evidence two other Dutch spectacle makers made their own telescopes within weeks of Hans's patent request. But like a lot of different things, credit is given to Hans because he was the first in recorded history to describe that telescope. So if the telescope was invented by a Dutch eyeglass maker or a medieval monk, either way, it was Galileo who kind of brought it into pop culture, right? He had heard about Hans Lippershey's invention and he was inspired and he made his own and he improved on it a little bit. Lippershey's claimed to magnify objects about 3 times, which is kind of more like a spyglass, like the pirates use in movies and stuff. It could have been used for military purposes, but Galileo in 1609, he made one that was way more powerful, and he did it without ever seeing the Dutch-made telescopes. He only heard about them and was like, I don't know how to do that, because Galileo was awesome. Either way, his telescopes could magnify by 10 times, and then he improved on his own design and got 20 and 30 times magnification. So that's pretty huge. It was a refracting telescope, so if you were around earlier, you know what that means. And it has a glass lens fixed on the end of a hollow tube. His 400-year-old surviving telescopes, they can actually be seen if you go to Florence, Italy. They are in a museum. He took that and he pointed it at the sky, and the first thing he discovered was that the moon, at the time thought to be a smooth, perfect object, was not at all smooth. It was rough with mountains and craters and all sorts of stuff on there. In 1610, he turned toward Jupiter and he discovered the moons of Jupiter moving around out there. And he also wrote about sunspots and Saturn's rings and Venus and all sorts of cool stuff. And he published it in a book called The Starry Messenger. And then he got in deep trouble with the church because they were all like, no way, bro. We already described all those things. God made them perfect. That's a whole other story. We don't have to get into that.